Hello, everybody. This presentation, as well as my paper, was all about remote ID, specifically for drones and unmanned aerial vehicles, often called UAVs.
This is an outline for what this presentation will be covering. The first thing we're going to cover is the impact. This will include the benefits and the maybe perceived drawbacks from the industry, as well as a rebuttal for why those drawbacks are needed in order to provide the highest level of safety for the aviation enthusiasts as well as just general civilians. Second will be technology improvements. There is a slew of improvements into technology that the aviation, specifically drone industry, can implement and utilize because of the ruling of remote ID it's very, very interesting. So we'll have to dive into that extensively, thirdly, is Part 107 certification. Although this is not directly tied to the remote ID, it's a bit of a sister role where a little bit like your car registration and your ID acts. And lastly is the cause for change. Why is this change needed? Specifically, how does this make us safer through this ruling? Okay, so before we dive into the bulk of the paper and presentation, I want to cover what the ruling was. So the ruling came out from the FAA in 2020, which took about 4 years to implement, and really they settled on 2024 to be the final year of compliance. It was originally 2023, but due to some manufacturing issues and concerns, they pushed it to 2024. The ruling specifically affects drones under 0.55 pounds, or if you are a professional using your drone. So by this I mean if it's me or you who's not making any money and just wants to go fly a drone, as long as that drone is under 0.55 pounds, you don't need remote ID. Now, the minute you start making any money on it or your drone goes above 0.55 pounds, you'll need a remote ID. So what is this remote ID? We've talked about it relatively extensively already, but it's a technology that allows the FAA to track drones in flight. This will include the identification, the coordinates, and even the operator. As I said earlier, it's a little bit like your car's registration or a license plate that can identify just some basic information about your drone. The FAA really insists that this is a really needed step for securing national airspace. And on top of that, manufacturers are also concerned that this could add to a lot of cost into the technology of drones, specifically for maybe small business owners and enthusiasts who may just want to dabble into the drones. Moving on, there may be some negative impact, I should say, as I mentioned, specifically in the cost. There is a lot of cost that goes into compliance. Specifically, manufacturers spent $27 million just to become compliant to the FAA with remote ID. A lot of enthusiasts and professionals are worried that this is going to get passed on to the consumers, and economics would tell us that would likely be the case. The worry is that this may limit new opportunities for business, which rolls us right into the next point. Rising costs can pose a challenge for younger companies. If you're trying to start a company who is a photographer, or as a photographer, or as a real estate agent, or maybe a construction manager, this may be an expensive yet very dire needed technology, which could make it much more challenging to implement this technology into your business. When you compare that to a Amazon or a Remax or some large, more established construction companies, you may be at an unfair leg, which could pose the concern of monopolies. Lastly is an invasion of privacy. Many people are worried that this might be an overstep from the government for their personal information. However, we'll get to the next slide with some rebuttals on these points. One of the biggest concerns here is the cost. Getting into the industry will be a big roadblock. However, the tracking of drones is undeniably needed, especially for securing the national airspace. This pairs pretty nicely with the new business challenge. Many industries have technology, especially for new technologies. If you think about how expensive the first Apple Watch is compared to what a used Apple Watch is today, of course, the brand new one when it first came out was much more expensive. So if your business maybe cannot afford a new drone at this point, it might not be the best time to implement it. Maybe wait a few years until drones go down and there's some cheaper drones on the secondary market that you can use. Lastly, the invasion of privacy is certainly a polarizing one. Ultimately, freedom comes at a cost, and it's not like we haven't seen restrictions on some high risk industries before. We can look at firearms, driving, and already in the aviation industry with aircraft tracking. So let's get to the good stuff, the positive impacts. First off is safety. By using remote ID for UAV and drones, the rate of accidents can be reduced, which the FAA has already found some positive findings there. Remote ID can also help the investigation period. By this, I mean previously, when there was no remote ID, if Billy Bob Joe flew his drone into the side of a plane, there was really no information to support that he necessarily did or didn't do it. On today's world, with remote ID, you'll be able to see who the operator is, and it'll be much easier to prove who did it. Operators will also be more easily identified and held accountable for accidents. Much like the example I just gave, it'll be much easier to identify who is operating a drone. Second is national airspace security. Obviously, this is a focal point for the FAA, especially in recent news. Air traffic controllers will be able to better see the entirety of the national airspace of their given area. Drones and UAVs traveling in unrestricted airspace can be identified. As I mentioned earlier, the operators, as well as the size of the drone, what drone it is, and just the basics of the drone will be easily identified by air traffic controllers through GPS. And there's even technology to restrict some airspaces, which we'll get into further later. As I mentioned, there's a vast world of technology through remote ID that I had not considered, which we'll also get into later, but it's certainly a positive impact. So diving right into technology, the first of which is tracking of repeat offenders. Remote ID will provide a way to compare one-time accidents or incidents to repeat offenders. And by this, I mean the FAA can more properly track who is constantly flying their drones into limited airspaces or into high danger areas, high traffic areas, versus maybe who it was just a one-time accident. So why is all of this tracking necessary? Well, for starters, a third-party company did an investigation on what a drone could do to an aircraft. An 8-pound drone, which seems obviously rather large, could fly into a 9-foot diameter engine. It would cause the fan blades to rip apart and cause shrapnel, destroying large and millions of dollars worth of equipment. This might seem like an exaggeration. An 8-pound drone would be pretty large. However, they did the experiment for smaller drones such as the DJI Phantom 3, and the same findings were discovered. And those drones, which is pictured off to the right, are sold over the counter and on secondhand markets for under $1,000. Drones can also be detrimental to windows and wings as well, causing millions in damage. Although aircraft were meant to sustain very high damages in turbulence, they weren't meant for direct impact hits from things like drones. Next is the geofencing technology made viable through remote ID. This is one of the coolest technologies, I believe, because I never really knew it was possible, let alone it was already implemented. Geofencing creates virtual boundaries that prevent drones from entering restricted airspace. A prime example of this is this picture off to the right, which is Nashville International Airport, which has set up a geofencing border to prevent unrestricted drones to fly in and out of this airspace. It can also notify the operator when the drone is near or entering a restricted no-fly zone. This creates a very difficult excuse for why you are flying in a no-fly zone. It can also render the unmanned drone unresponsive. So if the drone is getting closer and closer to a high danger area or a high air traffic area, it could just render unresponsive and stop flying. Ultimately, the FAA believes this can create a safer environment for the airspace. This is a video from a third-party company that may better help explain what geofencing is and some of the capabilities. It hasn't been wanting to play, so if I can't get it to play, I will add it to the discussion post and we can come back to it. It doesn't look like it's going to play, so I'll just be sure to do that. The next technology is a pretty imperative one. It's detect and avoid. This enables drones to detect other aircraft and debris and take evasive action to prevent a collision. The first thing that came to my mind when I thought this was, how on earth could a drone not see a Boeing 747 or really any other aircraft? But it's also effective towards smaller debris as well, such as parachuters, hang gliders, cell towers, and other drones. This can be really, really important if maybe you don't see a parachuter and you're flying your drone and it gets hung up into the parachute. That could potentially kill someone. And the same can be said for hang gliders. As far as cell towers and other drones go, you likely wouldn't kill anybody from it, but it could damage your drone, which could cost up to thousands to replace. The really cool part about this technology is it uses nearly a half dozen of sensors, including optical, acoustic, and radar. Pairing with remote ID is Part 107 compliance. Prior to remote ID, the FAA determined that it might be really needed and desired to have a certification course to fly a drone for commercial use. It is important to point out that commercial use by the FAA is identified as anything using the drone to make money. The license requires you to be at least 16 years old, be able to read, speak, write, and understand English, be physically and mentally safe to fly a drone, pass the initial knowledge exam, which is just a written exam, and pay the $175 fee. The goal of this is to just ensure that all pilots are trained and knowledgeable on drone flight regulations. This is really important, especially when it comes to the restricted airspace and really all the regulation compliance. Ensuring that the non-recreational drone users have at least a baseline of knowledge, I think, is very important. The next topic is the cause for change. Another way to put it is, why did we need change in the industry? Safety is the largest driving factor for the cause of this ruling. The risk obviously includes the collision, technological, and operational safety that we all included. Real-world incidents have already been seen from drones flying into restricted airspaces, colliding with other airworthy instruments such as planes or, like I said, parachuters or hang gliders. The role of remote ID is obviously very clear, and the managing of the drone's activity is another strong cause for the change. The FAA has found that despite the strength of aircraft against turbulence, they are not as strong against drones. As I mentioned earlier, an aircraft is very well suited for turbulence. However, it's not meant to be hit by a drone. This is another cause for change. How can we limit these accidents from happening? And with the technologies that remote ID brings, it's very likely and now very possible that these can change. There is also a direct need for restriction of certain airspace. Area 51, airports, military bases, they all have a very sensitive information about them, and obviously they're private for a reason. We shouldn't be flying drones or shouldn't be allowed to fly drones into restricted airspace like that. Lastly, the reason for this is also to ensure that operators are knowledgeable and trained to fly drones. That is specifically for the Part 107, but it's still a very, very needed part for the cause for change. There's a lot of biblical evidence to support that the government's job, or one of the government's job, is to keep the people they're governing over safe. Proverbs 29:2 says, "When the righteous thrive, people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan." The first part of this would be, who are the wicked and how can we prevent them from ruling? The wicked in this case could be caused from the lack of regulations. By having a lack of regulations, you can allow wicked people to do wicked acts. By this, I mean, without regulations, what's from stopping anybody from grabbing a drone and flying it into the side of an airplane that's trying to take off, or flying into a hang glider, or maybe flying it over a restricted airspace, such as an Air Force base or Area 51, areas that we obviously aren't supposed to see for a reason. Now back to the first half. When the righteous thrive, the people rejoice. We can rejoice when we are safe. Previously, the struggle of drones was that there was no regulations to ensure safety. So the government must ensure that we can thrive through safety and rejoice. They had to do this by adding regulations to the drone industry.
In conclusion, safety needs to be a concern for the FAA, specifically who is in our national airspace at what times. I understand that there are sacrifices that compliance may require, from extra costs to classes to licenses, but this is just a price to pay for safety. Technology is going to greatly benefit the aviation industry through developments of geofencing, detect and avoid, and obviously investigation efforts, as we spoke about earlier. Part 107 paired with remote ID just makes sense. It's like a car registration and a driver's license. And lastly, the government is in place to protect us and provide us safety. And one way they need to do this is through compliance of remote ID.